Our next question, Jim, sent in to CornyDriveThru at gmail.com from Steve Van Etten. Jim Ross has stated that when Muta was in WCW, he advocated for him to be the heavyweight champion as a babyface and was quickly shot down by the rest of the booking committee. What are your thoughts about Muta as a babyface champion during his WCW run?
Well, that's true, but partially true. And it's not like JR is trying to omit anything. But he did advocate for him to be a babyface and to even be the champion. There were other people on the booking committee at the time that wanted to switch Muta babyface. JR had the idea. I think he probably pitched it to Hurd. Hurd liked it because Muta was getting over as heels didn't get cheered back then that often, but Muta was getting cheered because he's doing the moonsault and he's doing the flashy moves. And even though he was in Gary Hart's stable, he was the cool one. And I mean, it goes back to 15 years before Bruce Lee. Muta doing all those cool moves and having the face paint and doing the moonsault and all that stuff. He's going to get over as a babyface. And so we heard then, because I remember Flair saying, well, they want to switch Muta babyface. And I could see that. And I even said, a comic book could be involved in this. As, with Turner Broadcasting's connections, Muta could be a superhero kind of fucking guy with a comic book or whatever the fuck. I could see the kids liking him. Kevin Sullivan didn't have a problem with it. The story that I heard at the time was that Gary Hart talked Muta out of it, which led to some consternation with the office and Gary, because Gary wanted to stay with Muta, obviously. Gary may have legitimately believed that it'd be bad for Muta to switch babyface, but the office perception was that Gary figured it'd be bad for Gary for Muta to switch babyface, and we're mad they talked him out of it. And then about that same time, that's where the deal happened at Starrcade, the round-robin tournament, where they beat him 4 times in one night. And that's when Muta got homesick and went back to Japan and has done quite well for himself since then in Japan, and probably enjoyed it better. But I think it was just, he was over there, he's starting to get over, but then his manager's telling him something, but the bookers are telling him something else. His command of English was not strong at that point in time to begin with. And then, he starts getting beat. And then I think, he probably it was time to go home. He'd had publicity.
This just came up on the most recent episode of John Arezzi's Pro Wrestling Spotlight Then and Now. Available at pwspod.com or wherever you find your favorite podcast. Last week we talked about the week before with Steve Beverly. This is the February 11th, 1990 episode. So this is the Sunday after the Tuesday Clash 10, Corpus Christi. And Muta obviously got over big time as a babyface in that match at the end of the show, partially because Flair and the Andersons had turned heel earlier in the night on Sting.
Right.
And then John talks to Dave Meltzer on this episode, and Dave says Muta no-showed every match he had after that event. That was his last night, and then he didn't show up. But the rumor was that the NWA was going to talk with Muta and see what they could do. John brought up, and when I asked him where he thought he may have heard this, we narrowed it down to possibly Paul Heyman, because he was talking to Paul at the time, even though Paul wasn't there. And Paul was talking to people there. But John said he had heard that maybe Muta was told to come home by New Japan, because New Japan was so upset at that point with NWA/WCW because of Flair pulling out of the Tokyo Dome show, which caused them to go to Giant Baba. I mean, that's a big move to go to Baba.
Well, yeah.
Hey, work with us. That they may have been upset about Flair being pulled out of that show, that they pulled Muta back. And Dave said, well, Muta actually was very close with Sakaguchi, to the point where a lot of the wrestlers over there would call him Sakaguchi's boy and, rib him about that. So potentially there is something there. Anything you've ever heard about that?
I don't. Well, I haven't heard anything about that. And it does make sense that that's a thing that could have happened, but we probably wouldn't have heard about it because they didn't want to fucking broadcast it. If they did, they probably just called Muta and said, come home, we're pissed. Yeah, because he had never no-showed anything up to that point in time. And then all of a sudden, between Starrcade and that clash is not even 2 months, and, shit's just going south. But a lot of shit was going south at that point in time.
Yeah, the other interesting thing, and I never thought of it this way, but when talking about the Sting injury, Meltzer said, and again, this is February 11th, 1990. This is fresh. Everything that just happened. They hadn't even announced firmly yet that Luger was going to be in the match. You hadn't even announced yet that Luger was going to be in the match. But Dave said, and I never thought of it this way, that he thought that they did the Horseman turn on Sting too early, at that point in time at least, because the babyface singles side was so light. You had the Steiners in tag teams. Pillman was being put into a tag team with Tom Zink. Other than Sting and Flair, there really weren't a lot of top-tier babyfaces in WCW at that time. And as soon as you do that turn, and then Sting gets hurt, you're kind of screwed. I mean, you have to turn Luger.
Well, but also Flair hated being a babyface. And Flair never wanted to be a babyface, and Flair was always looking for a way to turn back. And for long term, I can't blame him. But, he had been put in that position with the Funk thing, and that drew, and it got over. But he was like us after the program with Funk. Flair was like the Midnight Express after the program with the original Midnight. We were babyfaces just looking for a reason to switch back because there was no reason for us to be babyfaces anymore. So he may have rushed it a little bit, but he wanted to. Oh, and I'll say one more thing about Muta being a babyface champion. I would not have taken the step of putting the belt on him just because he couldn't do promos, and as a babyface, he couldn't have a manager. And as an attraction like that, he really didn't need. You needed your world champion to be able to speak. You needed your world champion to be able to get in personal issues and have, the Sting, Luger, Flair broader appeal. Muta could have been, for lack of a better term, like Hacksaw Duggan in Mid-South. He was the babyface that was over enough. He didn't need the belt for a long period of time while the champion was Magnum TA or was somebody else, whatever. He was the guy that was or an Andre. Muta would have been an attraction without the belt. I wouldn't have put the belt on him, but I had no problem with making him a babyface if that had ever come to pass.